This is the TTL Podcast. We want to teach you tactics to better understand and lead your technical organization. Grounded in our extensive experience leading teams and organizations, both large and small, and guided by the best research available.
Thanks once again for joining us on the TTL Podcast, where today we'll be discussing the core tactics to use in order to build a great and differentiated engineering organization, either from scratch or through transformation. Now, before we get to the meat and potatoes, I'd like to take a quick detour. And actually, before I even get to the detour, I want to mention that it'll just be me for this episode. So if you're hoping to listen to Andy, you'll just have to wait until the next episode. Now, back to the actual detour.
Andy here. Something we're doing with these episodes is that one of us writes and records, and the other does the final editing. So for this episode, as the editor, I have, and on the next episode, Mon-Chaio has, the opportunity to jump in at times and add our 2 cents, which I think should be a little fun. And now, back to the show.
I was just thinking the other day that the TTL Podcast is now about 20 episodes young. And at least for me, and I'm guessing for Andy as well, I actually sometimes struggle to remember back to a time when we both weren't podcasting together. It's kind of been all-consuming for a while now. But when I do think back to that evening when Andy was in Seattle and we first started talking about launching a podcast, one thing that I recall is us asking the why question. What would make us different than all these other technical leadership podcasts out there? And whatever that was, did the world need whatever it was that would make us unique? Would they even listen? Would we have any listeners? So lots of ideas flew around, but eventually I think we landed on what makes us unique. And it's something to the effect of, one, we wanted to explore issues deeply. We wanted to eschew the easy soundbite answers and really dig into both the research around a topic as well as what our many years of experience tell us about how that research is best applied, or perhaps not applied. And two, we wanted to talk about topics that maybe weren't being discussed broadly, topics that folks perhaps felt uncomfortable talking about in the tech world. Maybe these topics are a bit controversial, or maybe they're extremely nuanced with no easy answers, and so talking about it just leads to more discussion instead of finding a resolution. 20 episodes in, I feel like we've done a decent job of executing our vision. Definitely there's some hits, there's some misses, but overall, I'm quite happy with where we ended up. One challenge with our vision, though, is that it does necessitate a certain length and format for our podcasts, which I'm actually sure is not accessible to some folks. I mean, each episode is approaching about an hour, and we end up discussing many different facets of the problem in an effort to try to explore the issue as fully as possible. But that means that our podcast definitely doesn't lend itself to those that are just looking to get to the point. Can you two just get to the point quickly, please? And I get it. I mean, I was just telling Andy the other day that most of the other podcasts I listen to have timestamp links, so I can just kind of click on those and skip to what I really care about. And the TTL podcast doesn't even have timestamp links. So, yeah, it's not really approachable for everyone, or at least not for everyone maybe regularly every week. And I think that that's generally okay. That's why there's other podcasts out there. There's a flavor for every listener. But as Andy and I mentioned in our last episode, as we're coming up to the holiday season, we thought we'd try something a bit different. A bit more to the point, a bit shorter, a bit more soundbitey. Now, I don't want you all to get used to this. This is not going to be the regular format going forward. And obviously, this isn't just as a service to those folks that can't consume or find it difficult to consume our regular content. A big part of this is also for us. It takes us a ton of time to produce our regular episodes. And with the holiday, let's just call them holiday duties coming upon both of us, we're trying to find a way to reduce the amount of time we spend producing episodes for the next few weeks. But that's just till the new year, of course, where we'll dive back into our regular format full steam. But until then, our episodes are going to resemble what I think of as an old TV trope, the clip show. So, but no. Hold on. Don't turn us off just yet. Don't press stop. Just because it's closer to a clip show, that's not to mean that we don't think there's any listener value out there. We think there is, and not just for part-time listeners. The TTL podcast covers a bunch of disparate topics, and Andy and I don't often tie multiple episodes together into a cohesive picture. So, for example, what does psychological safety have to do with boundaries or developer productivity? But for the next few episodes, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to take a bunch of these disparate topics that we've discussed before and use them to answer our central question for the end of the year of 2023. And that question is, drumroll please, if I'm starting an engineering organization from scratch or trying to transform one that I've inherited, how do I go about setting myself up for success? So we'll start answering that question with this episode where we talk about laying the groundwork, the preparation, the foundation. You can think about this work as the strategy document or the vision document, the business plan. And this is sometimes the overlooked stuff of building teams that if you get wrong can really hinder you for a long term as you're building on very shaky or oftentimes no foundation. We'll follow that up with further episodes summarizing each of the remaining stages, from hiring and filling out your organization, to behaviors and processes to set up your new team for success, to structures to ensure things are operating smoothly, to a really super important topic of how to make sure your organization is constantly learning and improving. All right, so at this point, I think you've all indulged my tangential ramblings enough. So let's get right to it now. You've got a new engineering team, whether it's brand new or inherited. What are the first things you need to do to make sure you have a solid long-term foundation to build upon? In my opinion, the absolute first thing you need to decide is, what do you want the culture of your engineering organization to be? We talked about the definition of culture in episode 9, Demystifying Corporate Culture. Take a listen. Primarily transmitted and reinforced through rituals and symbols.
So maybe we say that our definition, trying to bring this together into that tighter package, because as you said, we're getting a little long. Culture is the rituals and symbols that are transmitted within a group that inform their behaviors and patterns of thought.
I like it. We might even want to make it stronger. I don't think that it just informs their behaviors and thoughts. I think in some ways it governs their behaviors and thoughts.
Ooh, that is a good point. Yeah. It's not simply, because that goes back to that kind of unquestioned unconscious. Yeah, it governs. It's a governing variable. It governs what they are going to do. So I think maybe we've arrived at a definition, which is that culture is the transmission of rituals and symbols among a group that govern their
behaviors and beliefs.
Behaviors and beliefs. Thank you. There we go.
It's still a little long and wordy, but I do believe that each of these pieces that we have in our definition now is really core and I don't think can really be left out. So I like it. I like that as a starting point. Sorry, not a starting point, but the foundation to our discussion.
Yeah, and I think that will serve us well later because we can take each part of it.
That definition of culture, I think, makes it clear why this is the facet with which you need to start. Culture governs behaviors and beliefs. So everything you want to do, everything from the processes you want to implement, every behavior you want to elicit, will be orders of magnitude more difficult if it runs counter to your culture. And this isn't just the domain of technical organizations. Here's a snippet of an interview with Steve Kerr, one of the most successful coaches in American professional basketball, talking about the advice he was given when he took his first head coaching job.
Before I started coaching, I visited with a few other coaches, and one of whom was Pete Carroll, and went and saw him during training camp in Seattle. And he was great. He pulled me aside. I was sitting in on all their coaches' meetings, watching practices, and he pulls me aside on the second day I'm there, and he goes, "So how are you going to coach your team?" I said, "You mean like what offense am I going to run?" He goes, "No, that stuff doesn't even matter." I'm like, he goes, "How are you going to coach your team?" I go, "Well, what does that even mean?" He goes, "What are the players going to feel when they walk into the building every day? What's the vibe? What's the culture?" We're like, "How are you going to just determine like what they feel when they walk into the building every day?" And that started this conversation where he basically laid it out, and it was an incredible story. But he said he had coached in the NFL for 4 years. A couple of years with New England, a couple of years with the Jets, gets fired, comes here to San Francisco as a coach with the Niners. And he said at the end of every day, he'd go and sit with Bill Walsh. And he said Bill Walsh taught him about culture. And he said that Bill Walsh told him, "You got to figure out who you are. What are the values that make you who you are? And those values have to become the culture, but you got to figure out how to make those values come alive. They can't just be words on a wall." So Pete was explaining all this, and it made so much sense because I had felt that in San Antonio with Pop and Chicago with Phil, but nobody had ever sort of expressed it that way. So for the next couple of days, we talked about, what those values would be for me, really looking into my own past and who I am, and then how to make those values come alive. And fascinating. But Pete said he really learned that from Bill Walsh. So yeah, pretty cool.
So yours
values are competitiveness, mindfulness, compassion, and joy.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And so we have a few team rules, but
we do.
Yeah, they're never enforced. So protect the team is a team rule, but everything is sort of encompassed with the values. And so what Pete taught me was if joy is one of your values, then there better be joy at practice. There better be joy in the building every day. So hiring people who have a sense of humor and who can laugh at themselves on your staff is really important. And hiring creative people who can, make practice fun and lively, and playing music and celebrating players' families and their accomplishments, birth of a child. Like, we want the players to walk into this building every day feeling the joy that comes from being in a place you want to be.
As Coach Kerr does a great job of describing, culture is foundational. Much like strategy, without understanding where you want to go, your initial steps will be faltering at best and at worst ineffective. You heard Coach Kerr talk about his key cultural values at the end of that previous clip. But how do you go about establishing your key cultural values, a firm base upon which everything else builds? The secret here is actually a minimizing mindset, where less is more. Andy and I talk about this process in the Demystifying Corporate Culture episode. Just recently, I've been on some web pages of companies where they say their culture is really important and unique, and it's 13 or 15 cultural values, which I think makes it very difficult. And I was told by a recruiter once, these values are very important to them. And so if you're in an interview, always go back to these values and really show how you're living up to each of the values. But again, to your point, Andy, I think where you want to align is with the small set of 2 or 3 or 4, maybe, core values. Because once you get beyond that, you're never going to align. And then you get into this problem of, we're going to use behaviors perhaps as a proxy into those. And you start to get into prejudices and biases in hiring.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point. The more that you're asking of that core, the larger you want that to be. Almost by definition, the less diversity of thought you can accept within your organization. We do know that more diverse groups perform better. They have more ideas to draw from. They have less likelihood of groupthink. All of that that's just going to happen. And so if you have so many core values that you say everyone has to have these, you're going to really struggle to get people who are a bit different into your organization.
And it's always a balance, right? The question may be asked, then why? So as you heard, the trick here is to pick the smallest subset that you possibly can, the core values that you believe in, and that becomes your starting culture. Culture will change over time, that's inevitable. But the goal here is to have a North Star, something that will be the guiding principle for your new organization, something that you can point to in order to explain the whys behind the hows of how you're working. The next step, once you have that foundation, is to start thinking about the boundaries of your organization. We talked a bit about what boundaries are and why they're useful in our first episode ever, analyzing a team situation using BART.
They analyze groups. The BART is not the train line in San Francisco. That would be kind of cool, but it has a different meaning here. It is boundary, authority, role, and task. And the idea is that when you're looking at the dynamics of a group, internally, this is a fairly important thing, internally, people have their understanding of what the boundaries are they're working within, what their authority is, and what other people's authority is, what their role is in any given situation, and what the task is that they're there to actually perform. And what you do in the analysis is you start asking a bunch of questions of nothing all that structured, but questions about these ideas. So for instance, you might ask.
Later on in the same episode, Andy goes deeper into the defining aspects of boundaries.
And looking for what's that unstated agreement, because in the BART model, so much of it is about making these things clear and explicit. And I've been trying to dig for where is the uncertainty, where are they unclear? For instance, on the boundary, one of the things the paper says is that the boundary has to be, it's crucial that it's clearly specified. Clear specification of time, task, and territory boundary should answer these questions. When, what, where. So they really need to know what is their boundary. And it has to be agreed upon. All the parties involved need to agree. It says, although a boundary may be clearly outlined, invested parties need to come to some agreement about what the stated time, task, or territory boundary is or how they interpret it. I think that how they interpret it is very important.
Right. And I think probably not surprising, a lot of the paper. As you heard, clarity of boundaries is extremely important. And it's even important at the very beginning, even before you have a team, for two reasons. The first is that your product will be subject to Conway's Law, and setting up the right organizational boundaries will help you create better software, and vice versa. I mentioned this phenomenon in one of our Vacation Cast episodes, episode 15.
Likes to talk about Conway's Law, and he touches on how a lot of organizations are using the reverse Conway maneuver. So Conway's Law states that the shape of your organization governs the software and the shape of the software that you build. Therefore, the reverse Conway maneuver would be thinking about what the shape of the software that you want to build, and then intentionally building your organization in the same manner. I thought that was very interesting. I had not heard about
I'm not sold that you should start with the shape of your software and form teams around it, especially in the early stages of your company and organization. But even early on, there are structures and boundaries you absolutely should think about pinning down, which, because of Conway's Law, will have large effects on your organization and structure. We discuss an important one, long-lived KPIs, in episode 2, Longevity of Team Boundaries. Some could be 50 people or whatever, but you have these AAA organizations. And then I think in order for them to truly have AAA and be autonomous and have accountability and have authority, they need to have a KPI or some sort of OKR that they are responsible for and then have the freedom to execute how they need to execute. Mm-hmm. And so then I start to think about, because those orgs have to be longer lived, the KPIs also need to be longer lived. And so we start to arrive at this way of building organizations where you say, what is my company's longer lived KPIs? I might change my tactics, right? And maybe this is more difficult for a startup, which is, according to some people, if you do it right, can change your product every day based on customer feedback. But for most companies beyond the initial stages, you kind of know what your central tenets are. You're selling something, right? So you have a team that has to do sales or e-commerce. You're shipping something, you have to ship, right? And so I think then I would say my guidance would be you start to think about your long-lived KPIs, those ones that don't change regularly, and then you attach them to long-lived teams that have AAA.
Right.
Does that make sense? Or explicitly laying out clear boundaries based on business-level metrics for your AAA teams, that is, teams that have authority, autonomy, and accountability, means that, due to Conway's Law, your engineering organization will be much more likely to build software that also aligns with your core business goals. So the broad effects of Conway's Law is the first reason to think early about boundaries. The second is that research has shown structure or bureaucracy actually helps create higher performing teams. It sounds a bit counterintuitive, but we touch on why that is in episode 14, The Undeserved Malignment of Bureaucracy. Take a listen.
To say you get rid of bureaucracy. Because one of the things that we found in our reading again and again was that the bureaucracy helps. This is, I think, the really hard thing is a bit of bureaucracy actually helps teams. So we found it in a paper that was talking about what was called team scaffolds. And there it was for teams that are in an ER or an emergency department, and they're changing constantly. They're constantly changing who's doing what and what the members are and what they're working on. And you might say, and they thought, well, you don't put structure on it because it's too fluid. And what they found was a little bit of structure, what they called a team scaffold, really helped. They got actually 40% better at getting their patients through. And the exact same thing can happen in software. A little bit of structure can get you much more effective. And their guidelines, their attributes that they were looking for in these scaffolds was that it needs to have boundedness. We're getting back to the BART and the boundaries. If you haven't listened to our episode on BART, it was our very first episode we published, back to boundaries. So it's boundedness, which is that you're explicitly clear who's part of the team at any given time. It's about being clear about the role set, which is that it is a group of interdependent, de-individualized, it's not people, it's roles, with the complement of skills needed to produce the joint deliverables. So at some point, Mon-Chaio, we might talk about this idea of staff liquidity and keeping track of what skills are needed for a job and what skills are available. But that is a clear part of the small amount of bureaucracy you're going to want for a really effective but loose, almost pure post-bureaucratic team. And they wanted collective responsibility, that those on the team are responsible together as a group for their product or outcome. And they found that if your team scaffold creates those attributes, and you just need enough to create that, then they get much better results. And I think the other aspect that they didn't find, but another paper did, is around hierarchy. Now, hierarchy, I think, is another one of those things that we are often very reticent to talk about and bring in. And it seems like the ultra bureaucratic thing of like saying who maybe has some authority over someone else. And I think there's two things. One is that the bureaucracy paper that started us off on this whole thing, they addressed hierarchy. And they said that hierarchy does not automatically compromise psychological safety in teams, but rather it depends on how hierarchical status is leveraged and specifically on whether those with higher status adopt a participative approach. And so the hierarchy clarity, if you can get clarity on what that hierarchy is, and you can train the people to take that approach, what they found was becoming clear in everyone's mind what that hierarchy is that they're dealing with. It also reduces conflict and increases performance. So it's another thing to reinforce. You don't need to set down the strictures of everyone knows exactly what their role is and they cannot deviate from it. But if they have those ground rules of what is the team, how are they expected to work together, what is their goal, then that is the minimal amount of bureaucracy you need for those really effective teams. So don't throw it all away. Don't just be like, hey, put those 10 people in a room and leave them to it. No, help them find that minimal structure to actually work together.
I like it. And in the initial paper that now the key phrase to take out of that clip is minimal structure, not no structure, minimal structure. No structure leads to organizations performing worse. So boundaries and structure, a part that people often neglect, is, in our opinion, centrally important to think about and plan for as early as possible. It's important to be clear, though, that we're not suggesting that you go off and put a bunch of different structures and ideals and processes into place prematurely. The concept of YAGNI still applies here. And for those that aren't familiar, YAGNI, Y-A-G-N-I, stands for you aren't gonna need it.
Or if you're from a more rural background like me, you'd say, you ain't gonna need it. None of this fancy aren't.
This is as true in organizational design as in software. And interestingly, the same misunderstanding about YAGNI reveals itself in org design as in software design. In order for something to be YAGNI, you actually have to think about it. Do the work of deeply thinking about it in order to figure out whether you need it or whether you don't. And just like in software, even if you don't need it now, that doesn't mean you don't do the quote-unquote extra work to establish the foundations so that when you do need it, it's easy to bring on in the future. So, to set yourself up for success when starting a new engineering organization, do your deep thinking, then take the minimal set you need to action on right away. Establish your minimal set of cultural values. Establish your minimal set of long-term KPIs and OKRs. Then use those to establish your minimal structure of teams and organizations. That's going to be your foundation. And in our next episode, Andy will touch on how to build upon that foundation and fill in the structure to build a differentiated and highly impactful engineering organization. That's it for this week. Let us know what you think of this episode or about the podcast in general. You can email us at hosts@thettlpodcast.com. That's HOSTS @thettlpodcast.com. Also, like us, subscribe, and comment on your favorite podcast platform or wherever you listen to the TTL podcast. So, until next time, be kind and stay curious.